Our next guest on the program is Labor MP Ed Husic, who joins us from our Sky News Centre. Thanks very much for your time, Ed Husic. A lot of talk once MPs are asked about the bushfires and the causes, they say now's not the right time to talk about it. Is now a good time for Anthony Albanese to be touring Queensland and talking about his support for coal exports?
I think he's just putting forward a very practical, common sense approach in terms of doing two things, which is being able to talk seriously and deal seriously with the impact of climate change and what we can do to play a part in responding, but also recognising that steelmaking coal is going to be part of the mix of resources that are required, in fact, in part, to build the very wind turbines and renewable energy generation that we're going to need to see happen. So, and on top of that too, I think it is important that we, as we've learnt out of the election, Labor's got a big task ahead of it in building support in Queensland, and that's what he's doing. So I just think it's the type of work that needs to be done.
Clearly, yeah, that was a lesson out of the election for Labor, but is there a timing issue? You're in Sydney now, you can see smoke blanketing the city. Is it a case of could have been better timing?
I think that we've got to be able to do all these things at pretty much the same time. Deal with climate change, respond to bushfires, think longer term about how people are getting their jobs and thinking about how we manage that into the future. That, unfortunately there is no luxury for governments to be able to say, well, we're only going to deal with this issue and put everything else off. In politics, you've got to be dexterous, and this is just one example of where we're going to have to do that. Frankly, I thought there was a lot of fuss made over those last few weeks. We've got to again be able to extend support to people that have been affected by terrible bushfires, but also the reality that we need to take steps to reduce the severity of those bushfires in the years ahead. People have been saying for years, if we don't deal with climate change, this is one of the byproducts of that. We've got to, again, without sounding like a broken record, Tom, we've got to be able to walk and chew gum.
So in terms of taking those steps, can you match that with what appears to be Labor's position now, supporting coal mining exports without any caveat at all? Is that the party's position from what you said?
I think when you listen to what Labor leader Anthony Albanese has said, he has said, you've got to have governments that take this seriously. This is a global issue that requires a contribution from all of us in our own way. Also recognising that we can reduce emissions, play a part in that, but also recognise that some of our resources, and there are a lot of people that are dependent on those resources here and across the globe. As I said, steelmaking coal is going to play a big part there. We've got to be able to do all these things simultaneously and deal with it.
What does that mean, though, when you talk about the global problem and any responsibility Australia might have? For example, with the Galilee Basin and parts there that haven't even been mined yet, would opening that up and exporting all of that coal, thermal coal, be part of addressing climate change?
I guess a number of things, Tom. Even with the range of policies that we took to the last election, and in particular trying to boost the level of energy generation through renewables, there was still going to be a part to play for coal in the foreseeable future, right? So that was a reality. And we also recognise too that when the international community and particularly the finance community is trying to work out what they'll put their money behind, increasingly it's behind renewable generation, which means that we've got to get serious about how we position ourselves to take advantage of that into the future. These things aren't going to happen with a snap of the fingers. It's going to take some time and give us some time to think about how we manage that process in the years ahead. We can do, as I said, think clearly about what needs to be done to reduce emissions and generate energy in a cleaner, more efficient way.
Right.
And also recognise too that in the immediate term, from what you can see, coal will play a part, particularly, as I said, in terms of parts of the world that are developing, that will rely on our coal, especially for steel making. There's going to be a place, and we've got to have a sensible consideration around that, and that's what Anthony's been saying.
Yeah, and clearly it's not going anywhere in Australia, around the world, in the short term and the medium term. But when we look at this longer, when you say thinking about the role to play, is the issue of Australian coal exports purely one for the market? Anytime anyone wants it, any company that wants to come in, pass the environmental approvals and go for it. Is that Labor's position?
No, I don't think so. Well, I think we've got a pretty sensible position, Tom. We're not... I mean, we can go over this again and again and again, but it's pretty much, as I've been saying, it's been getting that balance right.
But what is the balance? Because if Anthony Albanese is supporting coal exports, isn't it just up to the market, and whatever the world market decides, Australia won't put any roadblocks on it? Or is there a responsibility Australia has down the track to say maybe we need to pull back on this a bit?
Well, I think I've touched on it a number of times in this, and I don't think anyone's really said that it's up to the market when you consider that, if it was up to the market, why would we have a Paris Agreement? Why would we have international collaboration to reduce emissions and to support the generation of energy in much more efficient and cleaner ways? I mean, I think that is being sorted out, but at the same time too, you've got to be able to offset some of the things that are creating those emissions with, for example, the other issue that I'm very focused on is in terms of creating new sources of water supply. We've got desal plants that are very energy intensive. A lot of those plants, for example, do a lot of work in offsetting their carbon footprint by supporting, encouraging renewable energy generation. That stuff happens. So it is about governments and markets working together in a good way,
right,
in a solid way, to both reduce emissions and meet other needs that exist in the economy and community.
But so in some way down the track, I'll get to water in a moment, but in some way down the track, there'll be a role for the Australian government to decide, to roadmap out what we're doing with coal exports, not just our own domestic use.
I think that's already happening in part. I think the bigger, more productive role for governments to play is in supporting new forms of energy generation, as I said, that are much more cleaner and efficient. We've had a government that has been absent in this space for quite some time, talked a lot, not done much, and been fighting amongst itself. It's why we don't have, for example, a national energy guarantee in place, because the coalition simply cannot get their heads around the notion of being involved in a productive way in energy generation. So, Labor is absolutely committed to being able to, one, recognise the reality of climate change, two, do something about it and get the balance right.
On to water. A lot of focus, of course, of water in the midst of the drought in many parts of the country. We know we can't make it rain. We know we can build dams. But the other part is the water use in our cities. You cited this in a speech in Parliament last week about better use of recycled water in particular. What are you talking about exactly?
Well, I think a number of things. I live in a city that has just today imposed a new level of water restriction on Sydney-siders and people living in the Blue Mountains in the Illawarra. And on the very day that's come in, we've got suggestions that we need to get ready for even tougher restrictions, level 3 restrictions to come in. We've had, at a federal level, a very scattered approach to supporting states on urban water initiatives, particularly in terms of recycling, where we should be encouraging especially greater use of recycled water in residential areas. And in the Illawarra, Tom, one of the concerning things based on a Water New South Wales cabinet document that had landed in the hands of the media is a concern by Water New South Wales that with the depletion of the Warrenora Dam, that residents in the Illawarra on the current projections may be out of water in 2 years. Now, if the federal government has supported, for example, desalination plants in South Australia, they should be working, given that there is a focus on investing in infrastructure, they should be working with the New South Wales government, for example, in boosting desalination supply, for instance, in the Illawarra. We don't see any of that. The federal government has basically dismissed this as an issue since 2013, and I think we're paying the price for that absence of attention and care.
Is there sort of a long-term complacency? I mean, Australia's grown pretty quickly over a couple of decades. I've got to admit, I remember growing up when you sort of just turned the hose on and had a water fight on a hot day. And when you look at other countries and the way they do it, they'd be astonished at how much really good water that we can use for anything except drinking that just gets flushed out to sea.
And I think the complacency, you know, if you look at, for instance, the last 2 years, I mean, Sydney's dam levels have halved in 2 years, roughly. And during that period of time, people believed, obviously, that they could use water and there'd be no problem. But clearly, with the drought having bit already in regional Australia, and now it's reaching the urban fringes in a pretty dramatic way, you know, we're paying a price, in effect, for not really ramping up recycling, not thinking ahead on issues of desalination. Some cities have had to do it. Perth, for example, is getting ready to have 3 desalination plants. Melbourne's got one of the biggest ones, and in Sydney we're going to have to double the capacity of the existing desal plant as well. But, you know, really the federal government does have a part to play. Federal Labor under the Rudd government, when at a time former Treasurer Peter Costello said there's no role for federal governments in urban water supply or urban water infrastructure, Federal Labor did step in, did have active programs, and every one of those was pretty much cut by the coalition on assuming office in 2013. And I think that there is an active role, and I certainly would urge the Morrison government to work with states like New South Wales to increase desal capacity and find ways to recycle water, particularly for residential areas, have that available for people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, particularly you go to London, it's all they drink, and you know, it might sound weird, but it tastes fine, I can assure you. So perhaps something back on the agenda. Just about out of time, but I know that you were a regular with Janine Perrott, who is leaving the team at Sky News. You wanted to
Yeah, I was
have
really...
a few words on that?
Well, I think, you know, Janine has been watching corporate and political Australia. If anything's been happening worthwhile, she's known all about it, and I think she's been a tremendous voice on Sky. I was genuinely sorry to hear that she was going, and I think Australia's media landscape needs more people like Janine Perrott who just call it as it is, and that's all you really want out of journos. And she's just been an absolute... She's a national treasure for the Australian media, and I wish her all the very best, but I'd love to see her continue in some way down the track, because we do need people of Janine's calibre.
Amen to that, yeah. Her searing takes on the business world, the banks in particular, she didn't hold back. And
no, not at all.
would always cut through to the knowledge of business, always found phenomenal as well. Always remembered the scandals from decades before and what was perhaps not learnt. Ed Husic, appreciate your time. Thank you.